Good evening and welcome to the Nightly News. I'm Darby Biggs, reporting live from Logan, Utah, where Salt Lake Mayor Ben McAdams and Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox have just finished their first round of gubernatorial debates. Joining me in the studio tonight is Nightly News' correspondent Taylor Pratt. Taylor, thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having.
So I wanted to start off by discussing some of the statements made by Mayor Ben McAdams. You said that your team found some problems with some of these statements.
Yeah, we found that some of the statements either weren't correct or just weren't fully developed.
All right, so then let's get right into those. So let's start off with this statement about the tax rate. So Mayor McAdams said that I balance the budget every year, which is why the county has a triple bond rating and a decrease in taxes.
So this is a misleading statement. Other politicians have used this as well. It's meant to imply that taxes in general have gone down. The problem is you can have a tax rate stay down and say raise property taxes on an annual basis.
So has Utah seen an increase in property taxes in the past few years?
Yes. In fact, in 2015, Mayor McAdams actually proposed an $8.9 million increase in property taxes, which was approved by the legislature.
Wow, that is a large increase. So another point that the candidates were asked about was suicide prevention in schools, which is an important problem in the state of Utah, suicide.
Oh, absolutely.
And Spencer Cox, I thought, did a great job in explaining how serious this problem was. And he also brought up the legislation that's already in place for suicide prevention in schools here. Do you find it odd that Mayor McAdams didn't reference any of this legislation?
Well, what Mayor McAdams said specifically, and I actually agree with the first part of it, he said that children spend all of their day at school, so most of our resources should be pulled towards helping them in school, which is true.
Yeah.
But the reality is that Governor Herbert has already, and the state legislature have already done this. This last year in 2018, Governor Herbert signed 8 pieces of legislation, unprecedented amount of legislation, to put more mental health counselors in schools, to give them more programs for students that are struggling with suicidal thoughts or depression. Spencer Cox is the head of a suicide prevention task force.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that Mayor McAdams spoke of this as though it was still a future prospect.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he's talking about the legislation still being a future prospect, which is the alternative.
Right.
So I'd like to bring up another moment from the debate. Spencer Cox got a little testy with McAdams, calling his 3-night stay at a homeless shelter cute.
Yes.
But the lieutenant governor pointed out that he had backed down from the Draper residents concerning the homeless shelter, and McAdams said that money was going to be spent on other resources.
So unfortunately, this just isn't true. What happened, as we know, is that the Draper residents vehemently opposed any type of homeless shelter in their area. So all Ben McAdams did was move the shelter from Draper to South Salt Lake County against the will of the mayor there, I might add. And that same year, the legislator passed a bill, HB 441, to give him the power to put a homeless shelter wherever he wanted, and gave him $10 million to build 3 new homeless shelters.
So this is all really convenient for him then.
Exactly. I mean, the Draper residents ask you not to build it there, so then you get legislation to back up your position. And the main problem is that Ben McAdams said that these homeless shelters were a Band-Aid solution, and that we need to have other resources. It doesn't make sense then that the legislature would give you $10 million for these Band-Aid solutions.
Yeah, that seems a little interesting there. Something else is going on. So another point that you had a problem with was the question about Prop 2. So specifically, it's when Mayor McAdams said that medical marijuana was probably the safest alternative to opioids, which we know that opioids is a huge problem here in the state of Utah. So, and to be fair, Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox alluded to this as well.
Right. I mean, I had problems with the way both of them worded it. Specifically, what Mayor McAdams said is that medical marijuana is probably the safest alternative to opioids. The way this gets out into the public, though, is then it's then assumed that that's what it's an absolute statement.
Yeah.
The science on this is far from settled. The National the National Institute of Drug Abuse is still studying the long-term effects of medical marijuana. And medical researchers who have studied the neurological effects of people who switch from opioids to cannabis have found some alarming neurological effects.
That's interesting. So about Prop 2 specifically, would you say because the science isn't settled yet that voters should be weary of this?
No, not necessarily. Regardless of whether Prop 2 gets passed or not, that's not the issue. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this field. Our problem is with absolute statements like medical marijuana is the safest alternative to cannabis, to opioids. We shouldn't be saying this. It's not settled science.
All right. I agree with that too. Like, you don't want it to be misleading or anything. So my last question now is about the Head Start program that Mayor McAdams is responsible for starting.
Yes.
So now the mayor said that this gave them a 575% return on investment with future cost avoidance. Sorry. So you say that this is misleading. Why is that?
Well, so what the mayor omitted from that speech, when he says we will get a return on investment, he failed to mention that Goldman Sachs is actually a huge contributor to this Head Start program, and they will actually be the beneficiaries of quite a bit of this. And specifically, the way they'll be beneficiaries is by getting fewer children to be on special needs programs.
So this is all a special education avoidance kind of program then.
Exactly. And in fact, a lot of educators in the Head Start program have raised concerns that this program is going to benefit Goldman Sachs more than it's going to benefit the children in it.
Interesting. Well, we are out of time, but thank you, Taylor, and we'll be right back after the break.